You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello, welcome to ProveText. I'm Michael Halcomb. I'm here with Fred Long, and today we're talking about Galatians. Fred, you ready to jump into it?
I am. I'm ready. I was born ready. No, actually, I had to take a lot of classes to get this ready for Greek.
Yeah.
Dozens of Greek courses, and I've been teaching for 30 years. But I love it, and I love dialoguing with you about these things.
Yeah.
It's fun. I mean, isn't this the first dedicated podcast through the original language of any biblical text?
Yeah, as far as I know, nobody's doing anything even remotely close to what we're doing with Greek and Hebrew. So we have a good decent following, loyal following, and we're grateful for those folks who want to dig into Scripture with us. We hope the podcast keeps growing, but yeah, I think it's pretty unique. Someone just texted me or messaged me the other day and was saying something to the effect of they were very thankful for how we front the biblical languages on the podcast, that they didn't know of another podcast that does that thing. Yes, they said, I really like how the original languages are put front and center on many of the ProveText podcast episodes. The way you and Dr. Long treat them are not merely some scholarly exercise distinct from pastoral ministry, but directly in the vein of earnest Christianity and ministry. I don't know of many other online resources that combine the two in such a fashion.
Wow. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. That's great to hear. Appreciate that encouragement. Yeah. Well, let's jump in. I guess we're going to do Galatians 6, 7, and 8. 8 is kind of a long one, but we're going to see it's not so long in a certain sense. Nice literary structures there. I'm ready to jump right in.
All right. Well, here's 6, 7. I'll read it in Greek. If you're watching, you can also see it on the screen as well as hear me read it. So 6, 7 says, Me planaste, theos ou mukterizete, ogarean spire anthropos, tuto ke therisi. So that's Galatians 6, 7.
All right. Ascendaton. So I'm looking for conjunctions right away. Ascendaton means there's no connector, which can indicate a break. It could also indicate a parallelism, like if you're within a rhetorical flourish. But I don't see that parallelism. In fact, we're switching from third singular imperatives, let someone share in common, to now second person. And so plural. So you have ascendaton, you have a shift from third singular to second plural. So I think you have a section break right here. Now, it doesn't mean that it's unrelated to it. It just means that it's a bit of a break. And we should respect that. Probably a new paragraph. So this is how I translate that. Don't be being deceived. So don't be deceived. God is not mocked, or God is not treated with contempt. For whatever a person sows, this also he or she will reap. Yeah. So may with planasthe, that's called a prohibition, but not an aorist subjunctive prohibition. So may, if you have a negative command or prohibition, there is a construction may with the aorist subjunctive. That's not used here. We have may with the present imperative. So this, to me, is profiling or construing the verbal aspect of the present tense imperative, which is imperfective. And so this is suggesting like ongoing So this is an ongoing need to not be deceived.
Mm.
This is an attitude that we need to carry with us, and the content of that is God is not to be treated with contempt. Now, this verb mukterizo
Mm.
is kind of interesting. Mukter is a nostril,
Yeah.
so he's it means to is it's a causative stem, the idzo, so it's the turning up one's nose or nostrils to the
Mm.
Lord, and a contempt to look down. It's really to kind of look down on somebody with contempt. God is not to be treated that way. What does he mean? In what way is God not to be treated with contempt? Well, that's what we see in the second part of verse 7, 7b. We have a gar, which is supporting, and then we have an o. Ogar. O is what? What? And then we see an aeon, which is a conditional particle working with the subjunctive mood. So, ogar aeon spire, sows. So whatever sows, and then we have the subject anthropos. So whatever a person sows, that's the protasis. Whatever someone sows, this tutoke, this also theresi, he will reap. So a nice conditional sentence. It's called a future more vivid construction. Aeon with the subjunctive followed by a future indicative. I might have liked it to be a present general truth, but which would have been a present tense. It may have that kind of implication. But yeah, stating it in the future tense, whatever you sow, you will reap that.
Yeah.
I think the time frame in the condition is important because you don't reap it immediately as you're doing that thing. You're reaping it in a future time frame. So if whatever you do, you're going to eventually reap that. So yeah,
Well,
there's
this,
a little
I think,
chiastic arrangement there. So go ahead.
well, I was going to say,
So you
like,
have
in the previous
verb,
episodes,
subject, object, verb. So you have verb, subject, and then object, verb. So we're going to see this pattern A, B, B, A. We're going to see that particularly repeated twice in verse 8. I'm sorry.
no, in the previous couple episodes, I've been arguing that 6:1-6 is like a financial context. I don't know if 7 and 8 are part of that same financial context. It may be that the Ascendaton does issue a clear break, but this could be read, and it often is read by the prosperity people from like a financial perspective. But I do want to talk about this idea of a man reaps, a person reaps what he sows. And, I think that that's kind of a fascinating idea. And I've often heard like this sort of like blended in with the idea of karma, right?
Sure.
Where people tend to think that karma is like, you getting the consequence for what you did. But actually, I think the idea of karma is quite a bit different than that. And my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, in Hinduism, is you do have this concept of sowing and reaping. Like if I sow good in this life, then I will reap good. But that good is actually reaped not in this life. It's reaped um in my rebirth, and then the rebirth after that, and then the rebirth after that, right? There's the old saying, as a calf will find its mother among 1,000 cows, so your deed will find you out among 1,000 rebirths. And so karma is this idea that in Hinduism that I do good now, and then in the next life I'll reap the good for it, and then in the next life I'll reap the good for it, and so on and so forth. But I think in Christianity, I mean, Jesus talks about, sowing and reaping and harvesting as well. So I think there is this kind of like law of sowing and reaping going on, but it's different. It's not karmic. I think in Christianity, the idea is no, you actually do reap the consequences of what you do and say now, right? And there's another part of this, and E. Stanley Jones talks about this. He says, but that's only a half truth, right? You alone don't reap what you sow, right? You got to think about it this way. Other people also reap what you sow for good or evil, and you reap what other people sow for good or ill. And he gives
Mm-hmm.
this example. He says, like, a good father doesn't alone reap the good fruit of his good life and actions. Others reap it too, his family, his friends, community, and generally the world. A bad father, on the other hand, doesn't alone reap the bad harvest of his life and his actions. Others reap it too, his family, his friends, his community, and the world. Right? So, yeah, I think there's a difference. I don't think this is karma, but I think there is a underlying kind of like rule or law of like sowing and reaping going on in Hinduism as well as Christianity, but they're different. I don't
Yeah.
know. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's helpful, Michael, to hear you talk about that and summarize E. Stanley Jones. Yeah, Paul is not dealing with karma. I think when people use that, I think they're just using it non-technically. I think they mean it in the sense of what goes around comes around.
Right. Yeah.
So kind of a boomerang effect with things, and you get what you deserve in a sense. Like if you're acting like a jerk, you're going to be treated like a jerk yourself. So and I would say that that's kind of a good law in a sense,
Mm,
like because it's kind of like a natural way that we can be chastised um, in the world. Now, that's not the final story. I think what you share with E. Stanley Jones's exposition of that, I think that's brilliant and helpful to understand this because we not to think of it too individualistically, but yeah, but
well,
it's interesting here that Paul is definitely connecting this to having an attitude that mocks the Lord or somehow puts our nose up to God, that God isn't going to stand for that. And
yeah.
I think it's a good thing that he doesn't, because if we are indeed snubbing God, that's going to affect others. If others see us snubbing God, that's not good for them to see us do that, and to not bear any consequences of that. Um, but we're getting once you start getting going down this route, we could come up with plenty of counter examples where people, it seems like the evil people prosper, right?
Mm,
In fact, David
yeah.
was complaining about this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and situations in my life where I get frustrated because certain people are benefiting
Mm,
from being in relationship with my children when they have no right to
mm,
be. That's a violation. They violated
mm,
my family's integrity. They've been a part of that, and then they somehow get to benefit from that. So,
yeah.
the Lord is the one who sees all that and will work all that out. I think some of it is stored up. Paul does talk about wrath being stored up later. It's not our place to take this out on people. Um, yeah, so it's interesting that Paul is using this here, and it kind of causes us to wonder why. Is he?
Well, I
Yeah.
think if it's a context where Paul is giving some sort of mini apology for he is worthy of his wage, right? The one who receives instruction in the word should share good things, their finances, their support with their instructor. And he's saying, don't be deceived. God can't be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. I think there may be a connection there between these two things that
Mm.
um, whether they're going to support Paul financially or not, Paul is going to still reap what he sows. And then if they are willing to go against Paul and not support him, that is turning their nose up at God, and they will reap what they've sown.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's putting them on blast here for not maybe being willing to support him.
Yeah. I think it's indirect, but I think Paul is masterful about being indirect. In Philippians, he's asking for money, but you have to really read between the lines there. But he is. Look at the end. And he needs to be careful to not offend people. Like, you've already given, thank you, but I still need something. So how do you, so here maybe he's preemptively warning or trying to lay the groundwork that I will still need something from you, and I want you to participate in what the Lord is doing in and through me. But I'm trying to lay out a foundation for you to move forward.
And remember, this is his earliest or next to earliest letter, probably.
Probably. Yeah. It's interesting to see how these ideas get developed. Already I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians. So Paul in 2 Corinthians 9:6 also quotes this proverb. Except there he says, he who sows sparingly also will reap, and he who sows bountifully also bountifully will reap. So this is in the context of him urging the Corinthians to finish their collection promise to give to the International Relief Fund that they've accused Paul of stealing from. So he's kind of doing a defense and an advocacy to have them continue giving. And this verse really comes from Proverbs. If you go to Proverbs, I think it's 20, what is it, 20? God loves a cheerful giver. Where is that from? Oh, Proverbs 11:24. And 22:9, there it is. He who is generous will be blessed, for he who gives some his food to the poor. Verse 8. So Proverbs 22:8. He who sows iniquity will reap vanity. But anyway, it seems to be like a merging of text. And I think the Septuagint version of that, which I'm not seeing here in the Hebrew translation. So Paul, this is in Paul's repertoire that he pulls out again in 2 Corinthians 9:6. And there it's strongly chiastic as well. Sparingly is put right in the middle. It's a big adverb. Phedomenos. These big words are right in the middle. So sowing, phedomenos, sparingly, phedomenos also will reap. So sowing and blessing, in blessing also will reap. And that's what we see here is there's a chiasm, ABBA. We're going to see that in the next verse particularly, but also here. So interesting to walk around this. Verse 8 is interesting too when we get there. So let's translate that, because it's going to link to other themes in Galatians of flesh versus spirit. So do you want to read 8 and let's translate that?
Sure. Otio spiron isten sarka eavtu, ekte sarkos, therisi thoran, o de spiron isto pneuma, ektu pneumatos therisi zoene onion.
All right. So verse 8 is connected to verse 7 by way of an OT, which here is indicating support. Content, it's a content marker, but that content marker can be support. So support by way of elaboration, content. Now I'd like to write a paper or do research to differentiate different means of indicating support, because you can use gar as an independent proposition, ot as like a content marker, which sometimes is translated as that or indicating content, but then sometimes it's content marking in a way that supports, and that's what it's doing here. It's in that regards, the difference between gar and ot is that gar is an independent sentence proposition, whereas ot is linking it as a subordinate clause. It's like it's more integrally connected to the first statement. That's my best sense of it so far. Now, it also gets complicated because there's another conjunction that is sometimes used, epi. So epsilon, p, iota, epsilon, iota, or vice versa, epi. So, what differentiates these? And there's probably a couple other ones that can indicate this substantiation, support. So, verse 8, OT connects it closely. And here we have the chiasm clearly stated in two different ways. So because the one sowing into the flesh, his own flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. So sowing into his own flesh, so AB, from his own flesh, from the flesh, B will reap, and then the thing that's reaped is given at the end, destruction. Moreover, so here the de in the second part of verse 8, you have ode spiron, but the one sowing. De marks new development, but it can be used in contexts where there's contrast, and so can be translated as but. It just depends. So here, but is warranted, but the one sowing, there's the A element, into the Spirit, B element, from the Spirit, B element repeated, will reap. So you have the reaping, sowing and reaping, and then what they will reap, the direct object, is everlasting life. Zoein eonion. Yeah, zoein eonion. Yeah, and zoein eonion, that might throw you off because onion looks like it has a masculine ending, on, omicron nu, but it's going with a feminine noun, ain, zoein. But they actually are in gender agreement because onion is an adjective that has two endings. It's called a dual termination adjective. That and these adjectives are typically formed, they're compound forms. So when you have an adjective that's formed from two stems or roots, they will tend to have only two endings, a masculine, which is also a feminine ending, and then a separate neuter ending. And so eonion here actually is feminine accusative singular, in agreement with zoein. And everlasting, I think I need to footnote you for translating it as everlasting as opposed to eternal. A lot of times it's translated eternal life, but I like the idea of everlasting life. And I think we discussed that while we were translating through John's gospel. Remember, that seems like, how long ago was that? A decade ago?
Ages. Yeah. Ages. Yeah. Long time ago. Yeah, I still think that we're in this he's still speaking about a financial issue. I still tend to think he's either talking about personal financial support or the support for the, like what you call the International Relief Fund, to help the churches that were struggling.
Yeah.
But I tend to think he's still 6'1" all the way up to 6'8", and I think he's gonna keep doing down all the way to 6'10". I think those 10 verses are gonna be, in my opinion, talking financially. But it is fascinating to think about how in 8 that would apply, right? That the person who sows to please their flesh will reap destruction of the flesh. It sounds a lot like
Well,
the
from the
the
flesh,
uh,
destruction
fruit.
from the
The
flesh.
fruit. It sounds like the fruit of the flesh. That's what I called it, right? They talked about
Mm.
in chapter 5 versus the fruit of the spirit, which he had talked about also in chapter 5. So in chapter 5 you have sarx and pneuma sort of abutted, and then here so you have a callback going on here in 8 back to what we had in chapter 5, um but perhaps with an eye toward like finances here. um
Yeah,
and I
I think
wonder, Fred,
so.
if we
Yeah.
I wonder if the flesh isn't talking strictly about like fleshly desires, sinful things like the rotten fruit of the flesh, but also he's still talking about the circumcision stuff. So whoever is sowing into the circumcision movement, they're going to end up reaping destruction. But whoever's sowing into this like spiritual enterprise that Paul has been spearheading, then they're going to reap everlasting life.
Yeah. Yep. So
Yeah.
Paul is building up what he once tore down. He's building up the
Yeah.
body of Christ. When the right hand of fellowship was extended to him, he said, the poor only that we would remember, which is the very
Mhm.
exact thing I was eager also to do. So go back to
Yeah.
2:10, the
Yep.
remembering the poor. So, and this was Paul's really pet project that
Yeah.
symbolized the unity of the Gentile non-Judean church with the Judean church, and symbolized for him the reconciliation of the two. And this was why it was so offensive for him in Second Corinthians to be cut out. It seemed like they wanted to pull away from that giving, or they were withholding their approval of Paul. And this idea
Yeah.
of approval, dokimazo, dokimos, being approved. At the end of First Corinthians, he said, when I take the collection, he says, like, be sure to set aside money
Yeah.
when we take this to Jerusalem, send letters of recommendation, if approved, for approved people. So he says this at the end of First Corinthians chapter 15 to accompany me. Well, it seems like in Second Corinthians, they've rejected and disapproved Paul. So at the end of Second Corinthians, he's like, well, it seems like I'm unapproved, but I hope you can see now that I'm approved, and I hope that you're approved. I hope that you pass the test. And part of the passing of the test that he sets up for them is in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, that they would continue in their promise to give to the collection. And so this
Yeah.
idea of eagerness and giving is really important for Paul. So from the very start of his ministry, it seems like this collection is integral to his identity, and maybe like a relationship that he had, that he's trying to fulfill with the Jerusalem church reputed leaders.
Yeah.
So in his mind, this is a very important part of his ministry, and linkage, maybe even some authenticity of integrity back to um, legitimacy, to connect to the Jerusalem church. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right here at the end, that he's linking it in two ways: to teachers, helping them share burdens, especially teachers, but then to, you reap what you sow generally. And maybe the negative association to flesh is pulling forward the fleshly kinds of thinking that he's been confronting. We don't want to participate in that kind of fleshly stuff, but more broadly. Yeah, it's very intriguing how we're seeing these themes come from earlier in Galatians, but then also that reverberate into particularly Second Corinthians, where the collection is such a big deal.
Yeah. Let me say a word just for everybody watching or listening. I have Acts up on the Acts 11. If you look at 26 to 28, um, particularly 27 and 28. And he's saying, during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. 28, one of them named Agabus stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. And so what Fred was just referring to, at least in my opinion, is that this severe famine had hit and had spread, and it hit Jerusalem especially. And so like the mother church there, the Jewish church, was really suffering. And so what Paul makes is sort of his pet project as a way to bridge Jewish and Gentile unity is to go throughout the Greco-Roman world, and he's taking up a collection from these churches, these Gentile churches, and sending it, at least part of it, back to the predominantly Jewish-led congregations in Jerusalem as a way to sort of bridge the gap and create unity between Jewish and Gentile Christians. And so you have that in Acts 11, 27 and 28. And then in Galatians 2, he's referencing that again. He said, after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus. And he says, I went in response to a revelation, kata apokalypsin, meeting privately with those esteemed leaders. And I think the revelation that he's referring to here is that one he's talking about from Agabus. It's mentioned in 11. And then Fred just mentioned this, where if you keep reading, in 2:7, he says he had been entrusted to preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, that is the Gentiles. And then, they gave him the right hand of fellowship. And then in 2:10, all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I'd been eager to do all along. I think the poor here in particular are those he was just meeting with in Jerusalem, suffering at the hands of this famine. So when they say remember the poor, they're saying remember us in Jerusalem. And Paul's saying, I've been eager to do that all along. And so what he's doing is going out and raising money in these Gentile churches to send back to the church in Jerusalem. And that's why in a lot of these cases, especially like Galatians 6 and 2 Corinthians, what Fred keeps talking about, you do have mention of money. And I think part of the thing here is that if Paul's carrying all this money around, well, people are automatically suspicious of him because he also has to somehow live, and survive.
Yeah.
And so he's got all this money carrying around. People are suspicious of him. Now they're wanting letters of recommendation. You're thinking that maybe he's stealing from the pot. And he's saying, well, no, you should share all good things with your instructor. And when you do that, you'll reap what you sow. Like you'll either be against me or for me, but you're going to reap what you sow. And I think in the next two verses, 6, 9, and 10, he'll even have a little bit more to say about that. In my own mind, Fred, that's like how I'm reconstructing the scenario. Yeah. I don't know if you drive with that, but that's
totally. In fact, I have even more to add to that, and it came by way of my response to Jim Wilson. He gave a paper at the Biblical Studies Gathering, and I wrote a response to his paper that I was able to just find right now. It just kind of blows me away because I think it's. I'll try to explain that to you. I think I could do it shortly. This if you want to see this issue of giving to Paul and the money, look what he says in 2 Corinthians 11, 7. He says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? You Corinthians might be exalted because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge. I robbed other churches by taking wages in order to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to you, to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything, I kept myself from being a burden. There's the word baros again, abares. I kept myself from being a burden to you, and I will continue to do so. So this is how complex it is, because Paul is doing ministry. He doesn't accept money from people directly to minister to them. As a principle, he doesn't like to do that because he would look like a traveling sophist trying to get money from people.
Right.
So, but what he does do is accept money from others as he's ministering to others. While all this is going on, he has these needs. He's also raising money for the poor. So he's trying to keep all this separate, and it's not always easy to do so.
Right.
Now, as he's arguing in 2 Corinthians 9, that passage we were looking at earlier, he is alluding to pretty strongly Deuteronomy 15. God likes a cheerful giver. We're to give not grudgingly or under compulsion. So Deuteronomy 15. So Jim Wilson argued that there was this tithing cycle in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. So he looks at this tithe cycle, and what happens is that there's a year where people aren't to sow. They're supposed to. It's like a year where you're particularly supposed to be mindful of the poor and gather money for the poor because there's not active sowing going on. So there was something called a Sabbath year where they're supposed to let the land lay fallow, right, and not sow. Well, that's particularly when the poor are particularly vulnerable. Scholars have rightly understood that Paul's timing to give the collection to the saints aligned with the Sabbath year in AD 55, 56, autumn to autumn. So Paul was timing the giving of this collection at, I think it was Pentecost, where there would normally be a first fruits celebration. So, and it was particularly needful because there's a famine going on, there's persecution of churches going on, and it's a Sabbath year where there's not as much food, and the poor are more needy. So I think there's a background here that we need to reconstruct as well of the acuteness of this need. And Paul was trying to get there for Pentecost, he says, so he could deliver this gift. So there's something going on in Paul's thinking that I think we can reasonably reconstruct to the circumstance. Yeah. So I found that very fascinating. So yeah.
Well, we'll keep talking about this. We got a couple more verses, at least for this next section of Galatians, but I think probably 6, 1, and 10 creates or forms something of a section of its own. But yeah, so pretty fascinating stuff, and definitely brings up issues of handling money in the church, right? So this is why I've made it a practice since I've been in ministry for 20 plus years, but especially when I'm a pastor, I stay as far away from the money as I can, man. I'm never have access to money, never touch money, don't know who gives what amounts, don't know when people, are giving, and that money has just such a way of being able to skew things and to corrupt things. And so pastors have to be very, very careful and incredibly wise with regard to money. Stay away from it. Don't ever have anything to do with it. Don't be counting money ever. Don't be taking money to the bank. Don't be doing any of that, right? Like, just got to be incredibly wise and have good people in place when handling the money. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I know a guy who was a major contributor to the church, like major, and because of that, he didn't want to even be on the board of the church because it might appear that he might be entangled in how that money is being spent, and he didn't even want to, so I know that the integrity of that. So yeah, this issue of money and generosity, as in Enneagram 5, I struggle. I struggle with being generous, in certain ways. But yeah, giving and reaping what you sow. Well, I have a parting shot from Leo Tolstoy. The sole
Okay.
meaning of life is to serve humanity. So I think
Hmm.
we want to do good. I think we like that. I think people like to do good. Um, I think they just need a little bit of help to do that. And we in
Hmm.
the church should, just encourage that, to do good to all people. That's what Paul's going to say next time. But how are we sowing? What are we sowing, and how
Hmm.
are we sowing? We are sowing. It's just a matter of how. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Michael, for all your hard work and
Yeah.
helping us stay on track with these podcasts and YouTube videocasts. Is it called videocasts as well?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
I was just looking.
Yeah.
I was trying to
Sure.
figure out how many podcasts we have. It's over 700 now in
Yep.
our
Yep.
ProveText series. I copied and pasted all of the episodes down. It would be nice if there could be a nice centralized place to that people could find these and then search within a
Yeah.
page and maybe have them grouped by the right type. That'd be pretty awesome. I don't know if there's a way that we could do that. I'm not
I
asking you to
think you
do it.
can go
I know you get a
to.
lot of.
I think, well, you can definitely go to glossahouse.com and click the podcast link, but when you go there and click listen now, it's basically just going to take you to Spotify.
Yes.
And when you're on Spotify, you can do a little bit of
Can you?
searching through the podcast, but not a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see
Um,
that. I found another place that had a listing of our podcasts, and I was able
yeah.
to just wait for it to load all 700 of them, and then I selected all of them. So at least I have the
Mm,
title of them into one Word document. But I think
right.
it could facilitate people listening through ones that are appropriate,
Well,
grammatically or
on YouTube,
vocabulary.
they are segmented into playlists. So
Ah,
these
okay,
proof text episodes are a playlist. The What's in the Name are a playlist. The ones that
ah,
Mario Melendez does, like they're
okay,
all on our YouTube page, youtube.com/glossahouse. They are in playlists on there.
okay. That's good to
Yeah,
know. Yeah, and then maybe that's
yeah,
all that's needed. Yeah, great.
yeah.
Well,
So
thanks everybody, and we hope that you're benefiting from these and enjoy them as much as we do creating them. Enjoy listening, watching. If you have any
yeah,
suggestions, questions, let us know. Appreciate your feedback, and we hope to have you watch and listen to us next time. Take care, Michael. Take care, Bear. Take care, everybody.
okay.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.